Welcome to the podcast for the Tuesday morning Q&A with Boyd W. Shepard D.D.S. J.D. Each Tuesday morning Q&A podcast is an edited and shortened version of the previously held live Q&A Zoom session. On Tuesday mornings each week, join attorney Boyd Shepard for a 1-hour Q&A call where you can ask Boyd questions. Then hear his detailed and knowledgeable responses to the legal concerns and business experiences of other dentists. For more information on how you can join in on the Q&A each Tuesday at 7 o'clock a.m., please go to legaldental.com.
Good morning. Happy Tuesday. Good to have everyone. Thank you for joining. Appreciate all of you being here as always. Hope your Tuesday's off to a great start. Your week is off to a great start. January the 17th, third week of the year. And seems like it's gotten here really fast. And next week it'll be the 24th and the last week. And before you know it, January will be history. So it's amazing how quick the year gets off to a jump start. And I hope everyone's new year is off to a great start. So thank you again for being here. There's a few people logging in, and I will admit them in as we sit here and get started. I hope everyone has their coffee, and I want to remind everyone I'm here to answer your questions. I always send a reminder on Mondays, as you know, and it has the topic that I do plan to cover. And at the same time, if there's anything about the topic, certainly chime in. Ask a question about what I'm talking about, but at the same time, if you think of a different question, if you have a question about anything that you'd like me to answer while we're here together, I'll do my best. I laugh at myself when I go back and listen to the audio, and I know that sometimes I'm either stumped or there's been times when I don't want to give an answer, or I insist on an answer that may not be popular, and I understand that I do my best to answer the questions, and I hope that you bear with me, as sometimes I know the answer that perhaps a questioner is asking for, but sometimes my experience says, well, here's what you really need to be thinking about. So it makes me laugh at myself sometimes when I'm a little stiff on my answers, and I don't give perhaps the answer that everyone expects or wants to hear. But that's the beauty of this, is that you're getting an additional point of view. I do have 20 plus years of experience, and I'm not saying that my answer is always right. I do try to analyze it from every direction. And I do try to offer that as part of the Q&A session, is to give you all the sides that I can think of in the moment as you ask your questions. And so to me, your questions are invaluable. It teaches me, it gets me thinking about things perhaps in a different way because of the question you're asking, and because of the way that you are asking it. It's valuable to me to hear your questions. And that's why I always encourage you. It may not be today, but we're doing this every Tuesday, and I enjoy the Tuesday morning Q&A, and I really do appreciate all of you who are regulars every Tuesday morning. Thank you again for being here. And so come prepared with a question, send it to me in advance during the week. It's very valuable to me, so please do that. So yesterday I sent out an email, and the email posed the question that we'll be dealing with today. And let me go back and find my email real quick so that I read the question exactly. But basically the question was, here it is. Your office just received a call regarding one of your patients who, after a fairly routine dental treatment, left your office 4 hours ago, and you learn that they have just been taken to the hospital. In the phone call that you just received, someone is letting you know that your patient has been taken to the hospital and they are now in the emergency room. And the question is, now what do you do? And as you think about that, I'll give you some background on where this question comes from. The question actually comes from two different sources. The first source is this question derives from an actual case. I don't remember the year. I would expect probably about 2012, 13, 14, 15, somewhere in there. It's something that I integrated into my risk management course based on the experience of the question. And in the actual case, the background was that the patient in this case was a friend of the dentist. They had been friends for years. They were family friends, and the patient was an attorney, which made it easy for me to remember. And the patient and the dentist were such good friends that as two couples, they had gone to dinner each with their spouse about a week before this appointment, maybe a couple of weeks. And the lawyer, the patient, the friend, was complaining about how they had a loose crown that had been placed years before by some other dentist somewhere else, but now age, wear and tear, whatever it may be, it was a molar crown. I can't remember if it was upper, lower, left, right. I can't remember which tooth number it was, but it was a full crown, and it was bothering this gentleman. And it was a particular concern because as an attorney, he was a litigator, and he was going to be going out of town to represent a client in a trial, and the trial was expected to last a week. And the patient, the friend of the dentist, was concerned that they would have a problem with this crown during the trial period. And he didn't want to have a problem with this tooth while he's out of town, because he would be in a place where he couldn't get back to the dentist, his friend, and it was causing him some stress. And they were talking about this at dinner. And so, of course, the dentist recommends, well, before you leave town, come into the office and let me take a look at it, and perhaps I can temporize it, and where it won't bother you and you won't be in pain, let me at least take a look at it. Well, of course, this particular patient, being a friend, understood that and said, okay. So they made the appointment prior to him going out of town. And this is where the case starts to go off track a little bit, as what you would expect and what would normally happen. But because this was a long-standing patient with the practice and a long-standing friend, the medical history wasn't updated. There wasn't any informed consent for whatever treatment was decided on that day. There wasn't any of the usual board requirements for record keeping for this particular appointment. And so that was the first problem. And so as things progressed, the tooth in question was temporized. I believe that the tooth was re-prepped or prepared again to smooth the surfaces. I honestly can't remember if a new impression was taken or if they decided to wait to take an impression until the gentleman got back from out of town, which probably would have made more sense. But at a minimum, the old crown was removed, the tooth was cleaned up, re-prepped slightly. I guess there had to have been perhaps an impression taken to at least do the temporary, but the tooth was temporized regardless. Well, because there wasn't a medical history updated, the dentist didn't understand all of the different medications that this particular patient was on. And in the removal of the crown, there was an administration of local anesthetic, and the vasoconstrictor was in conflict with the blood pressure medications and the heart medications that this particular patient was taking for themselves medically. And this led to an event that was approximately 3 to 4 hours after leaving the office. And that's what the doctor and their staff talked about at the time, was that how everything seemed to proceed normally and how he looked fine when he was leaving, and it was completely routine, but there was some interaction possibly that occurred 3 to 4 hours after. And so, long story short, bottom line, it was determined later that there wasn't any fault of the dentist, but there were certainly some record keeping issues. So even though the dentist wasn't found liable for anything medically that occurred to this patient, there were a lot of record keeping issues that I've already described that you should have picked up on as I was telling the story. So I'm trying not to give it away. So that's where this particular question derives from. It's this actual story of this event that happened with a client of mine years ago, that we went through the process of having to interact with the dental board. And that's the gist of the question is, now what do you do when you find out that your patient has been taken to the hospital? Now what do you do? Now, I said that there were two sources for this question that made me bring it up today. The second source is when doctors have issues and have to respond to an investigation with the dental board, and that investigation leads to an informal settlement conference with the board, and they decide there needs to be some form of disciplinary action, whether it's a remedial plan or a warning or a reprimand or beyond. What comes out of that, if it's not dismissed, what comes out of a board case is a board order. So this is part of a board order. It's not the entire thing. I'm not going to show you all the images that I could produce that shows you the entire board order, but basically a board order has the details of the front, and it has the findings of fact, and then you get to about the third page, and by the time you get, depending on the case, it could be on the second page, but let's say the third page, and you finally get past the findings of fact that the board found during the informal settlement conference. And that's the place where you basically reach a settlement with the board. This is how this case is going to be resolved. There was a patient complaint. We've done our investigation. Our dental expert has looked at the case. These are the findings. You have problems with your record keeping. You have problems with the standard of care or some combination of the two. Here's our findings of fact. And then ultimately there's this board order. So in the order section, which is on about the third page, it looks like this oftentimes. This is an example. And so this is, again, just a section of that. And so this particular doctor in this case, and this is a completely unrelated case to the one I described earlier. This one is actually a case, an example from a case that was handled this past year. And this particular doctor had some issues with both record keeping as well as standard of care. And so you'll see there in the third part of the order, it lists out the continuing education courses that need to be completed in order to satisfy the board's concerns about record keeping as well as standard of care. This particular doctor was ordered to take 6 hours in risk management and record keeping, in addition to the hours in periodontics, diagnosis and treatment planning, and medically compromised patients. And you can get a flavor of what the case was about by looking at what the board ordered in this case, right? So as far as the risk management and record keeping goes, what happens there, if a client of mine or anyone, they don't have to be a client of mine at all, if they choose to do so, they can take a course that I offer through my office that's a risk management course. And that's because the board has approved me as a CE provider in the area of risk management. And so I have a course called Risk Management, Record Keeping, and Ethics for Texas Dentists that meets that 6-hour requirement. And they can go online. It's the legaldental.com law library. And you go there and, there's several subjects that are available in the law library, but that's where this risk management course is, right? And so the reason I'm telling all this background about the risk management course is that as part of that course, I have to have a way to evaluate that someone went online and did the time on the course, right? And so just like any other CE course that you go to, there might be an evaluation part or a quiz. And that's the only way we can do it online, right? Is to do a quiz. So as part of that quiz, this particular question that we're looking at today is one of the quiz questions because it tests whether or not you understand what you need to do in this instance, right? And all of that background to say the reason this question came up is that someone took the course recently in the past week and they submitted answers, and their answer to this question to me was interesting, right? And I'm not going to necessarily, I guess I'll share a part of that answer and why it made it interesting. But I just kind of want to work through what the answer should be first, and then talk about the answer that I did get and why it wasn't exactly right. So the good news is they still got credit for the course. Just because you don't get the answers to the quiz exactly right, that's okay. You're going to get credit, but that's the only way I can evaluate is that they go and they answer questions to a quiz. They email those to me. I read them. I confirm that you watch the course and work through it, and then you get your CE certificate. So all of that to say, can anybody, I'm going to quiz y'all right now, either type it in the chat or unmute yourself and tell me which board rule are we dealing with in particular with this question. Which board rule are we dealing with? Either type it in the chat or say it out loud and proud. Let me know that you know which board rule that we're about to go over and why it's so important as I get a sip. Hello, everyone. A quick break here in the middle. This is Boyd Shepard. I wanted to make sure that you know if you are listening to this podcast, you can receive up to 8 hours of continuing education credit in risk management that satisfies the Texas State Board of Dental Examiners 8-hour biennial requirement. To receive this continuing education credit in risk management, please consider subscribing to the podcast for the Tuesday morning Q&A. Go to my website, legaldental.com, for more information. Thank you for listening. Okay, so this should make it memorable for everyone. And hopefully you've never, number one, had to deal with this, right? Hopefully you've never had a patient that's gone to the emergency room, gone to the hospital, or beyond that, which we'll get into in the rule. Hopefully that has never happened, nor hopefully it never happens in your practice, but it does happen. And that's why it's so important to know what to do, right? So the rule is, of course, let's just review. How do we find the rules? We go to the State Board website. State Board website has the laws and rules link across that green bar at the top. You click that bar and it takes you to the board rules and the Dental Practice Act. And the particular rule that we are looking at today is Rule 108.6, of course, report of patient death or injury requiring hospitalization. Now, you may be thinking, well, wait a minute. The question says your office just received a call. You learn that they have just been taken to the hospital and now they are in the emergency room, and it was 4 hours ago. And the rule says, let's take a look at the rule. A dentist must submit a written report to the state board as provided below. One, the death of a dental patient, which may have occurred as a consequence of the receipt of dental services from the reporting dentist, must be reported within 72 hours of the death or such time as the dentist becomes aware or reasonably should have become aware of the death. Well, we're not dealing with a death in this particular case. So let's read number 2. Number 2, Rule 108.6 says, the hospitalization of a dental patient as a possible consequence of receiving dental services from the reporting dentist must be reported within 30 days of the hospitalization or such time as the dentist becomes aware or reasonably should have become aware of the hospitalization. Now, this part of the rule could apply because we are dealing with the hospitalization of a dental patient. And the part that gets tricky is the as a possible consequence of receiving dental services from the reporting dentist. And then it says must be reported within 30 days of the hospitalization or such time as the dentist becomes aware or reasonably should have become aware of the hospitalization. And then it says, for purposes of this section, hospitalization shall be defined as an examination at a hospital or emergency medical facility that results in an inpatient admission for the purposes of treatment or monitoring. So taking a look at the details then of the rule and what's required there, in our particular question, now what do? You've just received a phone call regarding a patient, and you learn that approximately 3 to 4 hours post dental treatment in your office, they're now in the emergency room. And the rule says the hospitalization of a dental patient, a dentist must submit a written report to the state board if it was a possible consequence of receiving dental services from the reporting dentist. Well, how are you going to know whether or not it was a possible consequence of receiving dental services? What would you do to find out if it was a possible consequence of receiving dental services? So the first thing, and this may be something where you need to train your staff on this as well, but whoever's making this call to the office to advise the office, my first question is, well, who did they speak to? Did they speak to your staff when they called to let you know? Who was it that called? Presumably it's not the patient because they're in the emergency room. So is it a friend, a family member? Did you get their name? Can you call them back? Who is it that's calling to give you this information? What is their name? What's their number? And who is it that took the call? Is it your office staff or is it you personally, the treating doctor who broke off from another patient potentially to take the call and find out what's going on? Because if you aren't able to do that in the moment, that's why it's so important to be able to call back and get more information. Get information about, well, what was it that occurred that had them go to the emergency room? What was it that happened that made it such that now they're in the hospital, right? Those types of facts are important. What time did all of this happen? Did they drive themselves? Did someone have to call an ambulance? What was the exact facts of what occurred? Where are they? Which emergency room, which hospital are they? And the reason that's important is because now, as a healthcare provider, you need to make contact with another healthcare provider, the person, the doctor, the staff in the emergency room, to gather information, as much information as you can. There's going to be HIPAA and privacy and all of that, but as a treating doctor, as someone who just saw the patient in your office, there's information that can be gathered that allows you to decide whether or not is this an event that triggers the rule? Is this an event that triggers the question of part 2 there? The hospitalization of a dental patient as a possible consequence of receiving dental services from the reporting dentist must be reported within 30 days of the hospitalization. Now, the good news is you have 30 days. My advice is you don't wait that entire 30 days. As soon as the board rule gives you that window of time. In that window of time, which 30 days is more than reasonable, if you learn right away, of course, okay, so what do you need to do? Number one, gather facts like I just outlined. Who is it that's letting you know about this? How did you learn of it? What are the circumstances that made the patient go to the hospital? Which hospital are they? And have you made contact with the hospital staff? And what can they tell you about the status of the patient and how they're doing and what their exact problem is? You're trying to decipher, is this something that's related or unrelated to the dental treatment that they just received? So in the case history of the case that I told you about, that was from years ago, that really was the genesis of this particular issue or story. In that particular case, there was a conflict between the medication that the patient was taking for a heart condition versus the local anesthetic and the vasoconstrictor. And now it's a question of record keeping, the calculation of body weight, the number of cartridges that were used, et cetera, is all of that in the records. The second thing you need to be thinking about, okay, how exactly do I go about complying with rule 108.6, and do I need to comply? And by the time this particular client, and I get this often, will give me a call and doctors will lay out the case for me and they'll ask me, do I even need to report? Do I need to even report this to the board? Do I really need to send the board my records and get involved with an investigation? Because after all, the rule does say, as a possible consequence. And so you might try to hang your hat on that possible part. And there's two ways of looking at that word possible. There's the way that you may want to look at it. I shouldn't say I mean, generally, that a dentist may, in this situation, may want to look at it as possible and find any wedge, any division, anything that could have interceded, anything that says, nope, there's no way that this was a part of or happened as a possible consequence of dental treatment. Therefore, I don't need to report this to the board because I'm confident that this was not a possible consequence. That's one way of looking at it. The way the board looks at it often is that the word possible is in the best interest of the patient. The word possible actually leans toward, is there any remote chance? That's what it feels like. The risk is, and what has to be evaluated is there any remote chance that it could have been a possible consequence? You see how there's two extremes of the definition of that word possible. Oh, it's not possible. There was this event. It was 4 hours later. It was many hours later. It was the next day. And so on. It's either a time issue or there's nothing medically that was going on that could have led to this as a result of dental treatment. So it's not possible. Versus, is there any remote chance that because of this conflict between, in our example, the medications and the anesthetic that was administered, if there's any contraindications between the two, is that close enough in the world of possibilities that you do need to report? And I'm here to tell you it's much safer and you reduce your risk by leaning towards the remote chance definition of possible. And the reason for that is if things go south with the patient, south being some sort of injury, hopefully not death, but possible, and I've seen those cases too. And if there is a complaint to the board, either by the patient themselves or a family member, and there's no report, right? That's what you need to think about. If there was no report of hospitalization and the board gets a complaint from patient or family member later, this is going to be on the investigation checklist. They're going to be looking at, well, where's the report of the hospitalization? Did the doctor know? Did the doctor learn of this? And if the board determines that, yes, this person actually advised the doctor's office, or it's written in the progress note, received call regarding patient in the emergency room, and now they're looking for the report of the hospitalization pursuant to 108.6. Now there's an additional line item, there's an additional allegation, there's an additional issue to deal with in the investigation. And let's say they do the investigation, and let's say your records are great. You have blood pressure and pulse. You have excellent records. You have everything described in 108.8 and 108.7, informed consent, details in your record keeping that align with rule 108.8. And let's say the standard of care, you met every element of the standard of care. There's nothing with respect to the standard of care that's at issue. Everything was perfect, but the board may feel like, however, it may have been a possible consequence of dental treatment, and you knew about the hospitalization, and you didn't send a report. Have I ever seen a case where that was the only issue and that was the only area of disciplinary action? In other words, record keeping was perfect, standard of care was perfect, the patient was hospitalized, but there was no report, and the doctor was disciplined for no report? And the answer is yes. I'm trying to emphasize the point that that's how the board interprets that word or that phrase as a possible consequence. So you have to be careful. You really have to analyze it, again, in the best interest of the patient and from the board's point of view. Get advice if you need to. Now, getting back to the risk management course. So as part of the quiz answer, as I go into a little more detail than the question I sent in the email yesterday, but I talk about, here are the details of this particular case, and I described that case from several years ago. And one of the doctors who responded to the quiz recently said no, that you did not need to advise the board or report the patient's hospitalization. And they used the phrase in their answer because it's not reasonable. It's not reasonable that the contraindication of the medication could have led to this result, in their opinion. And so that's the thing. That's why I wanted to look at rule 108.6, is because if you look at the wording again of part 2, or even in part 1, there's nothing in the rule that says whether or not it was a reasonable consequence, or if it was a reasonable possibility. There's no reasonableness question. It's just a pure, straight up, black and white question of whether it's a possible consequence. You'll notice up in part 1, if it's a report of a death of a dental patient, it doesn't even use the word possible, but it does use the word may have occurred as a consequence. And to me, the phrase may have occurred and the phrase as a possible consequence below in hospitalization, essentially those are the same thing. That's how the board looks at it anyway, is that It may be different language, but it's may have occurred or as a possible consequence. It's the same analysis, but there's nothing in the rule that says anything about whether it's a reasonable possibility. It's not a question of reasonableness. It's just whether it was a remote chance of it being a possibility. So that's our question for today. And again, I want to emphasize, I hope that none of you have had to deal with this particular issue in your practice. It's one of those things that when it happens, it's good to know what to do. I don't have an image for it, but I can tell you that on the state board website, they do have a form for report of hospitalization. In other words, when you want to, or if you need to report the death or hospitalization of a patient, there's a form that's available on the state board website in that same, let me see if I can get back there. This is just an image, but when you get into the state board website and you go to that green menu bar at the top, I want to say it's under the link there that says resources. And when you do the down arrow on resources, there's the form for the report of death or hospitalization. So get it now and have it available in your office, or hopefully this type of event never happens in your practice and hopefully you never need the form, but you do need to know that the board has a particular form. It's a checklist. It's everything that they're looking for. So the next natural question is, well, what happens once I report? Well, what happens is the board opens up a case that's much like a complaint case, and except now it's a self-report. You're self-reporting that a patient was hospitalized, or you're self-reporting that there was a death of a patient. And it's the same checklist that they do in every investigation, where you have to submit the dental records and other information about your practice so that the board can fully investigate and evaluate, everything that's going on with your office that may be peripheral to the case. So they're not only looking at your records, but they're looking at your CE history, whether or not you're compliant with your CE currently. They're looking at whether or not you're in compliance with any anesthesia permits that you may hold, if you're compliant with the requirements for your office staff. It's the checklist. Now, in the Google Drive for the Tuesday morning Q&A, the form for, I believe we already have the form for Rule 108.6, report of patient injury and hospitalization. And if not, I can upload that form and make sure that it's in there, so that I can either confirm that it's in the Google Drive, or I'll make sure this morning that it's sitting there already. Now, in the chat, there's someone has written, rule indicates report required if results in an inpatient hospitalization. Thank you for that. You're absolutely right. And I was looking at that and I got sidetracked in my discussion. That's absolutely right. So for purposes of this section, hospitalization shall be defined as an examination at a hospital or emergency medical facility that results in an inpatient admission, right? And so thank you for bringing out that detail. That is why when you learn about the hospitalization, the question becomes, now what do I do? I need more information. I may not need to report if it is an emergency room visit only that does not result in an inpatient admission. And the only way that you're going to know that is to communicate with the patient family, or the medical provider or the staff of the emergency room. You have to find out, was this patient admitted? I can't tell you how much I appreciate you pointing out that detail. I was looking right at it and I had it on my mind, and then I got sidetracked in the discussion. So that is a key component. That is part of why you have to gather more information, because you may not have to report at all if you determine that it was an emergency room facility visit, but there was no inpatient admission that resulted from that emergency room visit. So good catch, and thank you for pointing that out. That's absolutely right. And I've seen those cases too. I've been called by clients, and we go through the analysis of the rule. And I say, well, when you talk to the patient, when you talk to their family, when you talk to the provider at the hospital in the emergency room, do you know whether or not they've been admitted? And that's usually a question I'll get a call when immediately when a doctor finds out that a patient has been hospitalized. The doctor will call me, Boyd, what do I do? I say, well, we need to find out, have they been admitted? You may not have to submit a report at all unless if there's an inpatient admission, yes, we need to look at that. But if there's no inpatient admission, we don't need to make the report. I still advise them on the record keeping. Make sure your records are in order, because at some point they may be admitted. It just depends on the facts of the situation, but the kicker or the trigger there is definitely going to be that inpatient admission, which is why it's so important. And what I was emphasizing earlier is in the what do I do now mode, one of the first things you do is start gathering information. And that's exactly the reason why you're trying to find out, do I need to report at all? Was there an inpatient admission? So thank you for that. I really appreciate it. So an additional comment is inpatient is defined as staying at least one night in the hospital for treatment. And I would respectfully ask that you give me the source for that. That's probably true, but that's not part of the rule. I tend to be really, really particular about inpatient admission. We're not going to get, if inpatient admission happens to be overnight, yes. If inpatient admission could be inpatient admission for just 4 to 6 hours in the hospital for whatever purpose needs to be an inpatient admission. If you're saying that hospitals define inpatient admission as an overnight stay, or that you're required by hospital rules to stay overnight, that could be a question that you drill down on is, well, did the patient stay overnight? And in all likelihood, if they did, that it was probably an inpatient admission. I get your point. I'm trying to confirm admission. I'm not hanging up on whether or not it was overnight, although I see the wisdom of perhaps you're not able to get that confirmation, but you do learn that they stayed overnight. So in all likelihood, they were admitted. I still want to tie that up. It's leaning towards inpatient admission, but I want something a little bit more official than did they stay overnight. So in the context that you're telling it, there's different ways of looking at it. I agree with you. I'm not disagreeing. I'm just saying, me personally, I want a little bit more confirmation other than an overnight stay, because for all I know, they were in the hospital overnight, not because they were admitted, but because for whatever reason, they were in the emergency room overnight. So the distinction may make a difference, and you want to go in the right direction there, because you may not have to report, right? You want to confirm whether or not it was an inpatient admission. At the same time, being very, very conservative, I also want to make sure that if it was an overnight stay, that there's no question that you do need to report or you did not need to, because that could be a defense right there, obviously. So thank you for that. I appreciate it. We have about 15 more minutes, and I want to get to any of your other questions or questions about this issue that any of you may have. Feel free to unmute yourself or type your questions in the chat. I'm happy to answer whatever questions you may have. A comment, thank you for this, says that sometimes it takes hours for the patient to be even seen and may be dismissed with no real findings. Is that still considered an admission? Exactly. Great question. And that's my point, is that there's no two cases are the same, and it requires you to gather facts and take the lead on communicating with either family member or hospital staff or both to triangulate on the answers to these questions. I would say that admission has its own written form. It has its own demarcated point in time where this patient has been admitted as a patient, or the alternative is this patient was seen in the emergency room and was released without being admitted. And if the patient themselves or the family member doesn't know the distinction, then you'll have to try to gather it from a staff member at the hospital. So here we go. Here's a link that's been provided. Maybe this helps. It's from an insurance company, so take it with a grain of salt, and I appreciate that. So if you click that link, it should take us to a website. What is inpatient versus outpatient? Okay, so to me, that's a different question. Inpatient admission, so maybe it's not, okay, inpatient care. Inpatient care is provided in a hospital where you are admitted and spend at least one night, sometimes more depending on your condition. So again, yeah, this is information that's helpful. I'm looking for that point in time where you're admitted, period. I'm not looking for whether or not you spent the night. That's what I don't want to get hung up on, is the rule, the board rule doesn't say anything about having to report because you spent the night. You might have spent the night for some other reason unrelated to being admitted. And I think you see my point, I see your point. So thank you for that info. That link is helpful. I'm trying to emphasize an official statement from a treating doctor or staff that says, yes, this patient was admitted. Going back to the rule one last time. And quite frankly, that's part of the analysis. In the question that was submitted for today, now what do you do? It's not always going to be an easy answer. There's work that has to be done to determine whether or not this issue of inpatient admission has been satisfied. Exactly. That's what you do. I just said no two cases are the same. It's not always going to be an easy answer. First thing I'm looking at is not only that question, but have you written everything up in your progress notes? Is there a lot of detail, not only with this particular treatment that's coincidental with this hospitalization? How do your records look generally? There's a full analysis that goes into that. So that's the point of our discussion today. So thank you for that. Additional questions, either about this subject or any other legal question you may have on something that's on your mind, I'm happy to get into that in the next couple of minutes. Again, thank you for being here today, and every week, most or all of you. I think we do have some new folks this morning, like a couple, and this is typically how it goes, but there is a time now that I would be happy to take your questions on anything that may be going on. If not, then that means everything's great with the world and there's no issues. And then I'm very happy about that also. As we wait for thoughts on additional questions that you may have, of course, all of you know by now that there's other resources that are available to you with the Tuesday morning Q&A. I do my best, and I believe I'm up to date with the Q&A blog, where you can go back and you can look at all of the Q&A subjects, questions, and answers that have been summarized since May of last year. So there's quite a number now in the blog area of all the issues that we covered just for a review. The way that you can use that as a tool, there may be something that comes up in your office and you might think to yourself, has Boyd talked about that in the Q&A? And you can go to that web page. The link is right there in that image for the Q&A blog, and you can do a search within your browser and just see if any of the terms of your particular issue pop up on the blog page and see if we talked about it. And if not, then that's a great opportunity to say, oh, well, Boyd hasn't talked about this question yet. Let me email boyd@legaldental.com, and let me submit this for next week and discussion. Okay, so I also talked about in reference during the discussion the forms on Google Drive. That's where you can go to and access forms at no cost at that particular URL, that web link where you can get the documents that come up. Today, I'm going to either upload or make sure it's already there, the form from the state board for hospitalization. There's other forms in the Google Drive that would be helpful in a situation like this. One I'm thinking of in particular is the chart inventory checklist that's written out in such a way that it's a little bit easier to look at. You can look at Board Rule 108.8, but I've created a form that allows you to look at it more as a functional checklist. What are all of the things I need to have in my chart and why? And lastly, by being here this morning, if you're interested, you're eligible to receive free continuing education credit in risk management. I give 0.5 hours for every hour that we talk about risk, that we're online each Tuesday for CE and risk management. For today's discussion, I think that it would be appropriate to either give 0.75 or a full hour for today, because it was dead on the entire time talking about Rule 108.6. So I think today's would be eligible for a full hour of CE. So please be aware of these different web links. All of you should have these bookmarked and take a look at these. Also, as I mentioned last week, the audio from the Tuesday morning Q&A, what I do is I take the audio, and let's say today is 50 minutes worth of audio, and I condense it down to, it might be 15 minutes, it might be 20 minutes. It really depends on content and how it edits down. But I make it available, again, at no cost to anyone as a podcast. And it is at no cost to listen to the podcast. But if you want to receive CE by listening to the podcast rather than CE through attending on Tuesday mornings, you can still get CE, but the only way I can track it is if you subscribe. It's a nominal monthly cost to subscribe, and that allows me to track whether or not you are a true listener and you get CE credit through being a subscriber to the podcast. So I do, for those of you, you might tell your friends, and your friends may say, well, dang, Tuesday mornings at 7, I'm either seeing patients or I'm still asleep, and I'm not going to make that, but they might be interested in the podcast. So you can pass that along. And then lastly, of course, my reminder to everyone, please send me your Q&A questions to boyd@legaldental.com. Invite your friends to either join us on Tuesday mornings, or like I said, have them go to my website, legaldental.com, and follow the information to tap into the podcast. The podcast has about 16 to 18 episodes now. I started creating the podcast from the audio back in August of last year, I want to say. So there's quite a number already, and you can go back and actually listen to the discussion, which is going to have a lot more detail. And it's just like listening to this, except it's much more condensed in a shorter period of time. So I just want to make you aware of that. Let me read the comment. I feel there should be board rule posters up in each operatory wall. Obviously, my anxiety and heart rate go up anytime the board is mentioned. And there's a comment there saying that they took my course on the board rules, and apparently it left an impression, and I'm positive one at that. Thank you for that comment. I very much appreciate it. And again, I mean, I can't tell you how much I appreciate every one of you being with us this morning. We're right here at the end. If anybody has any last minute question, please feel free. I'm here for you. And but if anything comes up during the week as we get into this new year with your office staff, with any aspect of your practice, your business, certainly anything related to risk management or the State Board of Dental Examiners, anything that you may have a question about, any patient issues that arise, hopefully not, right? Hopefully you have no legal issues. I have folks contact me all the time and say, Boyd, I haven't talked to you in a while. And then they say, and I'm glad about that. And I'm like, yeah, but I missed you. So thank you for that. All right, well, if there's no additional questions, last call. If there's no additional questions, we'll sign off. Go out there and make it a great day. Have a great rest of your week. And I will see you on Tuesday next week, January the 24th, and look forward to it. We'll have a whole new question to deal with, and send me your questions, invite your friends, and look forward to seeing you then. Y'all have a great week. Thank you.
Thank you again for listening to the podcast for the Tuesday morning Q&A with attorney Boyd Shepard. For more information on how to join the weekly Q&A each Tuesday morning at 7 a.m., go to legaldental.com.
This voice was produced in Typecast, an artificial intelligence voice service.